Carl Sagan's famous television program called Cosmos, which was produced in 1980s, reached Russia a decade later. And I remember when I was a little kid in Moscow, I couldn't wait for that moment of the week when the next episode of the show was broadcasted on the television. There was a scene in the 10th episode of the program where Carl Sagan talked about famous libraries. And that moment and that scene got imprinted in my memory since I was 9. And recently, YouTube algorithm decided to recommend me exactly that short piece that changed my perspective when I first saw it.
If I were to read a book a week for my entire adult lifetime, and I lived an ordinary lifetime, when I was all done, I would have read maybe a few thousand books, no more. In this library, that's from about here roughly to about here. But that's only 0.1% or so of the total number of books in the library. The trick is to know which books to read.
You can imagine how much impact these words of Carl Sagan would have on 9-year-old me. Because when you are 9 or 10, you think that your life is infinite, that you can read all the books that were ever written, that you can watch all the films that were ever produced. Time is unlimited for you. This very short scene of the program, which would have been insignificant for a grown-up, changed the way I started looking at the world, because I realized that the time is limited and I should be very careful to what I pay attention to, because our attention shapes our entire experience of the world. The objects of our attention end up shaping who we are. This perhaps unintentional advice by Carl Sagan made me more intentional in what I choose to read or listen or watch. I realized that people who read a lot are not those who speed read books, but are those who read consistently. The most dedicated readers are mainly rereaders. As Donna Tartt, the author of Goldfinch and The Secret History, mentioned in her interview to Charlie Rose, she said that she's the worst person to ask what books is she reading right now, because she mostly rereads what she has already read.
What have I read recently that's so good? It's terrible to ask me these questions because I just read the same books over and over again.
You do?
Yeah. I love a book more because the first time you're reading a book, you're discovering along with the writer. It's sort of an inductive process.
But there is a paradox that you have to have a lot of experience in reading in order to understand what books to read and what books to ignore. And in this video, I would like to share with you 4 books that acted like a map to me as a guide through the world of literature, both fiction and non-fiction. These books help me to filter out what to focus on and what not. The first book on this list that I would like to recommend to you was written by Harold Bloom, who was an American literary critic who unfortunately passed away only 2 years ago, back in 2019. He has a book called How to Read and Why, which is an excellent place to start for those who love fiction. One of the greatest things about this book is that it is divided by the different genres, such as poems, novels, short stories. So you can go either chapter by chapter and read this book from the beginning to the end, or you can just open up the chapter on short stories where Bloom writes beautifully about Turgenev, Lermontov, Pushkin, or Hemingway, or Cervantes, whoever you are interested in. And then you can choose whether you would like to start with short stories or you are more a person who likes novels or poetry. The second book on this list is actually one of my favorite books. It's written by one of the greatest authors of the 20th century. His name is Italo Calvino. You might have heard about him from his perhaps most famous book called Invisible Cities. The book that I want to recommend to you is his Why Read Classics, and it is also a great map through the world of literature. The way Calvino writes. I actually recommended this book to many of my friends, and I also shared it on my Instagram page. One of the things that all the people who got this book told me is that once you open it and start reading the first sentence, you cannot put it down. There are certain works of literature that Harold Bloom didn't include in his book, but Calvino mentions here. But one of the things that makes Calvino a great thinker to me, he said that every private library is different from one another. Everyone's journey through the world of reading through books is different. And what makes a book classic is when generations after generations people say, I reread Epictetus, I reread Dostoevsky. It is what Donna Tartt told in her interview, that when we read the book for the first time, we discover the plot with the author of the book. The second time, we read the book to kind of fully grasp its message. Calvino's book is not only a great guide through the world of literature, but it is also a good advice on reading in general. The previous two books that I recommended focused on fiction, but I'm also very passionate about non-fiction. So the third book that I would like to recommend is quite thick. It's around 600, 700 pages long, but I hope it won't scare you or put you off, because it's Bertrand Russell's The History of Western Philosophy. The reason why I would like to recommend this book is because even if we focus our entire lives to studying only Western philosophy and no other philosophy at all, we still wouldn't be able to read all of the works that were published throughout the history. Bertrand Russell dedicated all of his life to studying philosophy. He was actually one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, who was only rivaled perhaps by Ludwig Wittgenstein. This book is so well written that you can read the entire 700 pages and not get bored at all. After all, it explores the whole history of Western philosophy, but also like you can come and check the separate chapters. You can read what Bertrand Russell wrote on Hume, or you can read his chapter on Descartes. You can go all the way back to the influence of Sparta on philosophy, or just read about Socrates. So it's a great book also that can help you decide which school of philosophy you would like to get deep into and what those schools of philosophy were teaching. And the last but not least book that I would like to recommend to you is very different. It's Alberto Manguel's A History of Reading. I guess like the title speaks for itself. It explores the way we read throughout history, and one of the interesting facts that I discovered is that we used to read out loud for the most of the history before the printing press became widespread. And not reading out loud was considered a little bit like a demonic. This is a brilliant book. I know I say the words brilliant and beautiful very often on this channel and on my podcast. Manguel's book is more about our habit of reading. And the reason why I decided to end this video on this exact book is because like Harold Bloom or Calvino, I'm also concerned about my habit of reading, because there are so many distractions out there. It is so much difficult to be alone in solitude to be able to focus on reading today. So I thought like the history of reading and the way it evolved can also act as a guide to us on how to shape our reading habit. I thought it would be great to share with you this book because it told me how the habit of reading evolved, that we adapt, and I believe that reading as a habit will survive if we will realize that it is worth paying attention to. As I mentioned before, what we pay attention to shapes up who we are. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it will be useful for you. I will leave all the links to all those books below so you can go and browse yourself. And since you sticked around so far with me, I thank you very much. I would like to tell you that I have a podcast where I interview authors. My recent guest was Matt Alt, who is the author of a book on Japan called Pure Invention: How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World. I also interviewed many other authors that you can find also in the description of this episode. So if you would like to receive my book recommendations, please consider subscribing to my newsletter, which is also going to be linked below.